This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 528. Drupal goes to the UN. On today's show, we're talking about the United Nations Open Source Week, digital public infrastructure, and digital sovereignty with guests Tiffany Farriss and Mike Gifford. We'll also cover local association as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guests today are Tiffany Farriss and Mike Gifford. Tiffany is the CEO and co-owner of Palantir.net with almost 30 years of technical consulting experience. Tiffany serves her team and her clients through strategic and agile mentoring, facilitation, and coaching. Her current work focuses on creating sustainable environments that enable high performing, diverse teams to solve complex problems. Tiffany has served on the board of directors of the Drupal Association for over 13 years. Tiffany, welcome to the show and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
And Mike Gifford is Civic Action's Open Standards and Practices Lead and a thought leader on open government as well as digital accessibility and sustainability. He has worked with governments in North America and Europe and spoken internationally. He is also a W3C invited expert and recognized authoring tool accessibility expert. Mike, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the second time. Maya Schaefer, Community Lead at Evolving Web and Lead Organizer of Evolving Digital, formerly Evolve Drupal, and a board member of the Drupal Association. Maya is doing it all. Maya, how are you?
I'm good. I'm happy to be back. Thank you.
And last, but certainly not least, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, how are you?
Doing well. Happy to be here. I just wanted to quickly mention Bergen reached out to me about the orchestration module of the week a couple of weeks ago and wanted me to mention that I think I conflated AI and orchestration. They are actually completely unrelated. Orchestration is just about connecting with external tools, kind of like Zapier. I think, John, you probably had a better handle on that than I did, but just in case anybody else was confused as well, orchestration is just about kind of connecting different endpoints. It has nothing to do with AI.
So it doesn't directly have to do with AI, right? Your orchestration could have an AI element as part of it, but it's
Yeah.
not like directly connecting into Drupal
The
AI.
the orchestration piece has nothing to do with AI, but you could use orchestration to connect to an AI agent, I presume.
Correct. Yeah. So if you look at Dries's example from the Dries note, he actually does like, I don't know, a simple example where he just does some manipulation of some content. And then he does more advanced where he connects to an AI and does like
Yep.
much more manipulation of content. But
Yep.
that is a great clarification. Actually, just was, and we're not going to turn this into the orchestration show. I'm going to fight the urge, but I was actually just with a client who was not using orchestration that in the Drupal sense, but using a service to kind of do some orchestration. I was like, oh my gosh, we'll be able to do this in Drupal soon, or like right now. But anyway, I'll dial down my excitement and turn it over to Martin Anderson Klutz, a principal solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own to talk about our module of the week. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Are you looking to create a website for a local Drupal association? There's a project on Drupal.org to help you get started. It's called Local Association, in brackets, EU Sites Project, and it was created in October of 2023 by Jeremy Chinquist of Drunomics and Drupal Austria. It only has a dev version available. It seems actively maintained. It does have, or it's opted into security coverage, but of course, without a stable release, doesn't actually have any in practice. And there is a documentation guide available to help with setup. The project does have 49 open issues, 4 of which are bugs, but because it's not a module, there are no usage stats available. Now, this is an unusual project because it's designed to help you quickly create a Drupal site, but it doesn't follow any of the usual patterns I've seen: a distribution composer project template or a Drupal site template. Instead, the recommended path is to clone the repo to your local and run a setup script. That creates your DDEV project, runs a composer install, and then a Drush site install, and even runs a Drush ULI command so that you can log into your built site with just a single click once it's done. Along the way, it will install a couple of custom modules. One populates a multitude of default contents, so you have a pre populated site, including navigation as your starting point. It will look a lot like a clone of the 2022 Drupal Netherlands site, though there have been ongoing tweaks to the overall setup, with the most recent in June of 2025. The other custom module provides some additional layouts for use with Layout Builder, and the project also includes a theme meant to be customized. As you may have guessed by now, this project started when the Dutch Drupal Association rebuilt their website in 2022 and wanted to share their work with other local associations. Drupal France was the first to adopt it, and there was a BOF at DrupalCon Lille in 2023 to discuss sharing it more widely. Following that, an international work group began collaborating to establish this project, and it was adopted by Drupal associations in Belgium, Germany, Norway, Finland, and London, England. Since today's topic is about positioning Drupal on the international stage, I thought it would be interesting to talk about how local Drupal associations have also formed their own federation to reduce effort. So let's talk about local association.
I'm interested in that existing config flag that they passed to Drush SI. I've never seen that, and that I kinda wanna do a show on this now and find out how they're building it and maintaining it because it seems like kind of a nice middle ground of, like, not quite a recipe, but not quite a database dump starting point. So, seems useful.
Yeah, I think probably the previous time I had seen it, Bernardo Martinez had been doing some presentations about having a theme that could import configuration, and he was using a similar flag as part of his process. So, but yeah, I agree. It's not something that you see every day by any means.
Interesting. Yeah, I am also interested in that. I think anytime you have kind of these sorts of like starter points and things like that, like I don't know, the easier you can make it for the user. Martin, you might have said this and I might have missed it. Any indication about how many sites are kind of like built on this or like are using this
So on the
as a starter?
project page, they list out, I think it's 7 different ones. It's possible there are other sites that have used that as a starting point, but certainly in terms of actual Drupal associations, at this point, I would say, yeah, our best indication is 7.
Hmm, interesting.
Oh, yeah,
How do
they have separate sub-sites for each one too. Like, they're using the ecosystem to link them. So, like, there's a local association, AT, CH, etcetera. I think you
I
you
see.
can see how people are using the sub site. Yeah, so it looks like the AT one is for France, Belgium, German, Switzerland, Austria. So, yeah, that's interesting.
so Mart have a little bit of a question here. So I'm interested how this compares to kind of what you're doing with like your work with like event platform and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, great question. So, really different focus. So, as an example, on the project page for local association, they talk about the features that you get out of the box, being able to manage news, events, partners, cases, component pages, and basic pages. So, component pages, I'm guessing, is sort of like layout builder landing pages.
Yeah.
Whereas event platform is really more focused around sort of a campsite where you're collecting session submissions. It's got a built-in rating mechanism. There's an overlap certainly around like news, and there's probably a couple of other things if you were to dig into it. Partners may be equivalent to sponsors in event platform, but I would say the focus of the two is very different. Probably a local association underneath it would have a variety
Yeah.
of sort of camps that are actually running the individual events.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. So this is kind of like the bigger organization as opposed to specific event event silos. Got it. That makes sense.
Exactly. But
And
also, as yeah, I think Nick was pointing out, from an architecture standpoint, very different in terms of how it's set up to sort of create that site as a starting point.
Yeah, it always like when I hear things like this, it always reaffirms my philosophy that there's never anything really like new in Drupal. Somebody's always done it, and we say there's a module for that, and like I love it because I'm like, okay, I have this idea, but I'm like, somebody has already had this idea. I know it for a fact. Let's go find it, and then you find stuff like this, and you're like, oh, there it is. Okay, it makes my life way easier. Awesome. Well, Martin, as always, thank you for finding a perfectly on topic module of the week. If folks wanted to suggest a module or chat with you, how could they go about doing that?
We are always happy to discuss potential or past modules of the week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
All right. Well, thanks, Martin. Talk to you next week.
Sure. Thanks, week.
See you then.
Okay, let's jump in. We have so many topics to cover today. This is going to be an amazing, amazing show. So let's jump in to our first question here. Recently, Drupal went to the UN for the United Nations Open Source Week. Tiffany, can you tell us a little bit about the UN's Open Source Week and what Drupal's role played there?
Sure. Yeah. The UN Open Source Week was a week-long event hosted at the United Nations in New York by the UN Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies in partnership with the UN Office of Information and Communications Technology. So they hosted it June 16th through the 20th, and there were two official days at the UN, OSPO Day, and then there was the Digital Public Infrastructure Day. Those were the two kind of plenary sort of sessions. Then there was the Hackathon Day at the beginning, where there was a project where they were focused on UNICEF and things like that. And then there was an editathon concurrent with that. And then where I think both Mike and I were participating in the maintainathon, where they got together a bunch of open source, maintainers, and we talked about kind of shared issues. Then there were side events at LinkedIn and PwC. It was interesting because it was this very global multi-stakeholder kind of assembly. You have the technologists, you have the policymakers, you have open source communities kind of all coming together to have the same conversation around a couple of really core themes, right? We were talking about open source and open technologies, we were talking about digital public infrastructure, and we were talking about digital governance and cooperation and kind of collaboration innovation. So there was just a huge range of topics and amazing people from all over the world that kind of were there. And I think what it said to me was that open source is recognized not just as a technology choice, but as a leader and a platform of choice for the infrastructure for the kind of digital governance that we're seeing emerge around the world. So Drupal obviously belonged at that table, and as part of that conversation, we're such a an embodiment, a real world kind of example of everything that some of the UN sustainability goals are striving at, right? We are a very mature community-led platform that already powers so many of the digital public services around the world, whether it's in Europe or Australia, everywhere. And it really shows, I think we show how collaboration can serve the public good. So it was a really exhilarating week. Mike, what were your thoughts?
Absolutely, it was amazing, and I just wanted to also highlight that if people don't know what an OSPO is, it's an open source program office. That this is becoming increasingly interesting and relevant in government agencies and educational institutions, and then it's already had quite a standing in large corporations who are looking at promoting and encouraging open source development inside of those organizations. But it's something that the governments are starting to go off and to build on, and it was lovely to go off and connect with people from CMS.gov who are there, talking about the open source program office that they had set up there. I think that the other thing that Tiffany didn't mention, but she should have, is that she did a wonderful job representing our community in front of the stage of the General Assembly, and was just a wonderful ambassador to the open source world that was at it wasn't in the Security Council, but it was in the room next to the Security Council. So it was like this is as high a platform as I think Drupal has gotten, and Tiffany did a wonderful job explaining our perspective and what we brought to open source in governments around the world. The other thing just to add is that this is an interesting time for governments, and the United Nations is certainly no different. That governments around the world are trying to figure out, well, how do we deliver more with less? How do we try and innovate? How do we look at issues about like the challenges we're trying to deliver and find ways to make that happen? And open source has over the last 20 years really demonstrated its value and its relevance, not just to the public sector but to organizations around the world. And it was amazing to see people from the Germany Sovereign Tech Agency, or now it used to be the Sovereign Tech Fund, but talking about how they're supporting open source and investing in that was great to see. Tim Lehan from the Drupal Association there as well, and looking at what these organizations who have worked with and benefited from government investment in core infrastructure and the foundational digital infrastructure that we all rely on. Like our modern world relies on this digital infrastructure, and there's a few organizations that are starting to sort of think strategically and start investing in this, not simply because it is good for the organization, but it's really good for the ecosystem, and trying to think beyond the individual or project-based focus of the entity, and seeing leaders from around the world talk about their initiatives, to share their ideas, to really be inspired by what's happening off of outside of Drupal. And I definitely enjoyed connecting with the Typo 3 people who were there, and they're taking a whole other perspective and approach to evangelizing their product and building a community in Africa and in other southern countries that I think is there's really a lot to learn from in terms of building independence and bringing on that next generation of younger developers who are willing to push this project or push projects ahead in order to build a long term, to build that next generation of open source developers. Where are they? How do we build them, and how do we maintain them?
So what other, aside from Typo 3 that you just mentioned, and obviously Drupal, what other projects were there? Because I imagine it wasn't just CMS focused. It
No,
sounds like it was broader. So who did you all meet there?
Python Foundation, Alpha Omega, Typo 3 was obviously there, Gnome was there. I talked to some folks. Then there were even smaller ones that, there was I talked to some folks from, an art tool that is built on Python. Other ones that you talked to, Mike?
I think it was interesting. There's the projects that are external to government, but it was interesting just the number of government focused efforts that were being developed as well. And it was great to connect with folks at the Chaos project, which is chaos.global. They have a Slack community as well, looking at how do you measure the health of an open source community, just trying to measure and organize that. On the Friday at PwC, there was an interesting focus on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and these are really basic elements of like, how do we support human flourishing on this planet? This is all stuff that should be entirely non-controversial, because it's like every one of them should just be about supporting people and planet. And yet we're in a space where there's controversy, unfortunately.
So, couple of questions, because I think like you guys mentioned a lot of different open source technologies there. Well, let me go back like a little bit. Tiffany, presenting at the UN bucket list item, like check that out off, right? That's pretty awesome.
It was incredible. And I had asked if my son could actually come. And so it was a really special moment, not just to be in front of, like, it's just like you see on TV, like you're there, your name is in the in the lights, and then you're up on the big screen. It's incredible. But to be there with my son and have him understand, right? So I was pregnant with him at DrupalCon Chicago. He's been in and around Drupal for so long, but to have him be there and be part of the maintain-a-thon and those conversations and the whole week, it was just really, it took that bucket list item to kind of a whole nother level for me.
Man, you get bonus points for bringing family along. I don't know if I could do that and have my family there, because I'd be like, all right. The other thing, in in the world outside of kind of this event and speaking to this group, but like in the world, right? We often hear Drupal. Oh, Drupal still exists? Oh, well, last time I used it, it was like old and crusty. Any of that there? Anybody there that was kind of like Drupal?
I think there was a lot of the governments that are there are already aware of Drupal, and they certainly don't come from that perspective because 'cause they're using it every day. The UN uses it. The
Mm-hmm.
site that everybody, went to for this conference was in Drupal, right? So, I think that one of the things I was kinda there was to really elevate what Drupal has to offer to other projects that are trying to go down the same path. I mean, it is no small feat that we have been around for almost 25 years now, and there we have collaborators from over 150 countries in the world. We are the embodiment of everything that the UN is trying to encourage, right? We have an intentionally distributed, open, and participatory governance structure. We have structured our collaboration in a way that makes it possible for all the hundreds of thousands of people who have and still continue to contribute to Drupal to be able to participate across nations and across languages and just understanding that the way we did this is very special, right? The way that we have the not just the accessibility, which Mike is incredibly involved in, but the multilingual support, the automated testing, the transparency of our contribution, and then the recognition of how we're contributing, both in code and in non-code, and that we have defined our norms, our ways of working, and not just our ways of working together, but what happens when we disagree. All of that goes to I think what has made Drupal such a sustainable project over all of this time. That's what's driven our success. So if others are there trying to kind of incorporate, elements of what's already working, part of it is for us to get off the island and start telling that story. We have solved so many of the issues that a lot of the younger projects and foundations are dealing with. And so it was just very eye-opening to me about how much we already do really well. I
Yeah.
think in Drupal, we often focus on what could we improve? Like we're always, we're
Hmm.
constantly iterating and we want to be innovating. But I do think that there's something really special about the way that we have built this Drupal culture that has driven our longevity. And that longevity is what makes Drupal such a core choice for digital public infrastructure. Like you don't change bridges every day,
No.
right? And you need
Yep.
something that's going to be around for the next 50 years. And I think Drupal is that thing. So, to a certain extent, that reintroduction and that elevation of, Drupal isn't just, it's just not just another project. We've demonstrated that we can modernize, we can be here for the long haul. To just be able to have that conversation and talk about how Drupal serves millions every day through the sites that we run, but then we've also provided these meaningful livelihoods to hundreds of thousands of us around the world. So it's pretty incredible what we all do together.
Probably billions every day, actually. If you look at all the number of services that are available, the things that people touch on a daily basis and have no idea that Drupal's involved, and possibly you don't even have the possibility. If there's a headless implementation, how would you even know that there's Drupal in the back end, right? But
Yeah.
the other thing that was like building on Tiffany's point, the idea that there's not just one there's an ecosystem of professional entities that are involved in contributing to Drupal and governing Drupal and building this community. People who have got to know each other over that 20-25 year period. I mean, remember DrupalCon Chicago. That was a great conference. Thank you once again for organizing that. But it was a like fascinating to go up and to see how like so many open source projects have one cornerstone agency or firm that's backing up most of the work, and so many open source projects on GitHub are run by one person or one organization, and they have very few contributors around that. And that is it's still, I mean, it's good that it's open source, but having multiple people involved, multiple agencies involved, and having a governance structure, a mature governance structure behind it, means that there really isn't any opportunity to have that vendor lock in. That if you're dealing with other open source tools, even if it's open source, like you're not guaranteed that investment is going to be there over the long term if you don't have the
Yep.
governance behind it that separates an individual's choice from that. And we don't have to, the WordPress community is going through a lot right now, and they've got a massive group of people using that software platform, but they don't have the mature governance program that they have for 60 or
Yeah.
70% of the web to have invested in that platform. Like
Yeah.
it's it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's almost kind of two sides of the same coin. Like I always go back to OpenZWave, which was a project that Home Assistant, which is another open source project for home automation, relied on for its Z-Wave integrations. And Z-Wave, for our listeners, if longtime listeners will probably have already heard this, but Z-Wave is just a protocol for automation devices to speak to each other. And Open Z-Wave was one developer, and tragically, 5 or 6 years ago, he lost a lot of his home. I think there was a lightning strike. It broke his laptop and a few other things, and the project died because of it, because even he himself couldn't set up his tool chain again. It was so kind of esoteric and had been sitting around a long time. So it wasn't even like he's still around, but the device that he had his build chain on for that open source project died, and he wasn't able to recover anything. And kind of a silver lining out of this is that another group of people came together and built a node based open source project for managing Z Wave, and it's got a lot more collaborators, a lot more modern tool chain, and evolves a lot faster like the JavaScript world seems to do. So, you know, it's a sad story for the original maintainer, but it's a win still for open source in general. But to your point, Drupal doesn't have that weakness. They've hammered out the governance side of it, and there's thousands and thousands. We still need to figure out how to make it more sustainable for individual people. Individual pieces like ECA relies a lot on Jurgen, right? Webform relies a lot on Liam and Jacob. And, if we could find a way to spread that out a little bit more, it'd probably be more sustainable. But Drupal has solved a lot of the single point of failure pieces. So,
I think Drupal's resilience is super key, right? And I think plurocracy is hard, right? As we now know, right? And we've invested in it. We've consistently come back to it. We have those hard conversations. And, as it's the reason I've been on the board for so long. I think that the governance of the project and on the project side, but then also the governance of the community side, the governance of the infrastructure we provide, all of that really matters. And, the fact that we don't have a single privileged actor is part of that resilience. The fact that we are moving toward a Drupal federation where we have, associations in many nations across the world. I think it just again shows how out ahead we are of a lot of the parts of this conversation.
so pivoting back to the show notes, you mentioned that you were there to kind of espouse a lot of Drupal's solutions to these problems, but what did you learn from other projects? Because is always good to learn from other people's lessons rather than learning from your own hard lessons. So, were there any takeaways that you think the Drupal community could start looking into implementing themselves?
In terms of approaches of organizing and managing the community, I think that there was definitely exciting to meet with people from the chaos community and to see what's happening with the OSPOs and to see how that the cultural pieces of this are being developed at scale in organizations that are not, they're not tech organizations. And I think that was interesting to sort of see how that cultural piece is something that even in tech organizations we can benefit from, because it's as those of us who've been involved in open source for a long time, it's hard to remember, like with GitHub now, that's the way software is done. People are familiar with it, but they don't realize the struggle that it was beforehand. How much progress we've made having, for those of us who remember using CSV and SourceForge, like that was a whole other era that so many people who are now involved in open source are not familiar with, because they started after that phased out of its predominance. But I think that cultural side of just trying to go off and make sure that we're doing more and we're learning more to sort of talk about the benefits and the values and the approaches of collaboration and reinforcing that value is what that's what I got out of that.
I think I learned a lot about what's going on in Africa in particular. So on the panel I was on, there was some from the East Africa Union. I have a little bit more insight into what's going on at some of the NGOs like World Bank and other places, but really understanding how adoption of open source isn't just about the technology itself; it's about the opportunity that it creates. And because Drupal, we've very much been a scratch your own itch. I do think that we have a lot of opportunity for how we end up engaging in more emerging markets and using that as development, not just in terms of human capital, like helping people learn these skills, but then having that same kind of economic benefit that many of us have seen throughout Europe and throughout the US in developing businesses that are based on it. So I think that part of what I came back really inspired to think about is what might a model for engagement look like so that we could, kind of underwrite some of that development. And again, as Mike said earlier, Typo 3 has been doing a lot of really great work in like Burkina Faso and in places like that, I think. So, what might we do more to support development in South America, in Africa, in other places, and think about it more as an intentional outreach rather than we tend to blow on embers that are already kind of smoldering, right? And help those to catch fire. But what might we do more?
Tiffany, I'm wondering, based on what you just said, was there any thought or look at, like, outside of just development, right? So, like, obviously, we can teach people how to develop for Drupal, we can teach people how to develop for open source, but as you just pointed out, like, Drupal has a lot of, and I'm sure other open source projects have a lot of uses kind of that both connect disparate systems, bring things together, but also can empower businesses. So is there any thought or any did you hear anything about, yes, let's work to train more developers, let's work to get more people involved in open source, but then let's also go out and educate, small business owners to the fact that, like, hey, you could pull this thing off the shelf and, kind of get it up and running yourself and potentially have your own e-commerce store, or potentially have your own marketplace, or potentially have your own, social platform that you could use, right? As opposed to, like, paying services and doing that. Like, was there any talk there about maybe education and enabling, like, maybe small business owners or, entrepreneurs to kind of jump into open source technology?
I don't think that was the focus of the conference. I was
Mm,
impressed with, one of the programs that another attendee was telling me about was that in, I believe it's South Africa, whenever contracts, major technology contracts are given to multinational organizations, there's a recapture of funds that goes directly into developing the capacity within South Africa to be able to offer, to be able to do that themselves, right? And so
mm,
that program is
mm.
multi-tiered. It's yes about developing the next generation of developers, training small business owners to be able to use that technology, and then, essentially being able to create technologies like that at home. So there's kind of this
Mm.
multi-tier to, all right, well, we do need to upgrade and modernize and all of our systems. Great. If the only vendors who can bid on that aren't from South Africa, how do we then make sure that part of this money goes into making sure that in 30 years that's not still the case? So I
So
think
it's
that's
like
kind of leading,
it,
yeah, first
it's
leading
almost like
business.
it's almost like a government on the job training program where you're like, yes, come in, outside company, teach us how to do this thing, and then we're going to start to try to develop those skills ourselves and do it. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
It's more like a money capture. So there's like a tax if you're not in the country. And then that goes into
And
other
then that
programs that are
goes,
more targeted.
got it. Okay, that makes sense. I
I
mean,
was
still, either way, I still think it sounds like a good idea. But
I was just gonna add that there's the sovereign tech agencies talks about not only they're funding these projects to support the German government to try and make sure that the German government has a solid open source infrastructure for their technology, but they're really supporting the whole German economy. So this is the open source is not just for government, it is for everyone, and then including sort of businesses and whatnot on that level. But also procurement is was came up a few times, and it's a real interesting challenge. Like how do you procure open source software, and how do you move projects from capex to opex? How do you make sure that you're able to invest in it on an ongoing basis, like a road, like a bridge, like things which governments understand that you need to go off and maintain bridges, like that's something you need to go off and do on a regular basis. But so often with government contracts, the contract runs out and it's like, oh well, on we go. Let's carry on to the next thing. And it's like, no, like all this stuff needs to be maintained. If you have anything digital, you can't just leave it there and let it run and assume that it's working there. If it's not, if the security isn't being updated, if the features don't align with the rest of the growth of the API and change the change of
Yeah.
standards and browsers and whatnot, it doesn't work. So it's sort of moving that sort of mindset around in terms of how how governments are thinking about buying technology.
Well, and not even just that piece, but also making part of the operational expense going back to fund whatever project you're using, like the Drupal Association, right? If
Right.
a government site is spending, millions of dollars funding, building and maintaining whatever number of projects, sending 10 grand a month to the Drupal Association is is nothing, and would be a huge game changer for the types of things that the Drupal Association can offer, which directly benefit everybody using it, right? So,
Well, and I think that was part of the conversation I was there to start to have is around this idea of upstream support. And often in open source, we think about upstream support, rightfully so, as that solo maintainer working on that module that you're using. And that is a part of upstream support for Drupal. But then there's also the actual invisible infrastructure that the Drupal Association provides. And how do we have that conversation as a risk mitigation, right? I think, it's not just an altruism, oh, this is the right thing to do sort of question. But to Mike's point, I do think those OSPOs are key to being able to solve this. So part of the function of an open source program office is to help both the end users within an organization as well as those procurement officers understand how to engage with open source in a productive way, right? It isn't You don't get to see the transformational benefits of using open source if you are just gonna go get this software for free. You're like, "Oh, I got this for free. This is great." Okay, well, then you actually just have technical debt. You haven't actually achieved anything. But are you contributing your patches back? Great. That's kind of a first level that you're part of this dialogue within open source. That's step 1. Step 2 is, really, are you putting your modules back out there? Are you contributing back into the ecosystem so that we can reduce the amount of public dollars that are wasted recreating the same solutions over and over and over again. And then, of course, the gold standard, the best you can do when you're engaging in open source is make sure that you are contributing to the full life cycle, the full ecosystem of the projects that you're involved in, making sure that those who have written the modules you depend on are, able to both be sustainable in themselves and then also have succession plans. Are you contributing to the infrastructure that you rely on to pull, to run Composer, for example, right? I think people just don't necessarily think about that invisible infrastructure in the same way that when you drive over a bridge, everybody uses that bridge. Nobody really thinks about it, and you funded it through your taxes, right? So this whole conversation around digital public infrastructure is that same conversation, but about that digital infrastructure that everybody uses, but nobody really thinks about, and we're super dependent on. So how do we pay for that in the long term? And where does the money flow? Does it get to the right places?
Let's maybe go a step back. Tiffany, maybe you can, like, describe what is digital public infrastructure in simple terms, and why should we consider open source as part of this?
So digital public infrastructure is the idea that you have these shared building blocks of the digital foundation that allows people or governments or businesses to interact safely online. So it is like digital identity systems or payment systems, your data exchange layers, and then registries, right? So all of your records, the power of your health records or your land records or education systems. So the idea is that you want to build those core layers once openly and safely so that everybody can innovate on top, right? You don't want to recreate the wheel in the same way in Drupal. We don't want to have 10 modules that do the same thing, right? We would rather continue to iterate on it. So, you want, and if I'm a policymaker in a country, I want my country to have, you know, obviously a digital identity system, easy payment systems. I want them to be able to do what they need to do online, but I don't actually want to pay to write that from the ground up. So, how do you do that? How do you think about it? And this is where open source becomes a really good fit because we have transparency. So, you have that trust factor, right? You can see how it works. It's not a black box. It becomes a shared investment. And this was particularly important in more emerging markets in the world. There was someone from the government in Haiti was talking about how they're, kind of innovating around different places. Even in France, shared some of the work that they're doing on their digital stack, their French digital stack. So it becomes a shared investment. And then that leads into the digital sovereignty point, which is you don't want to have lock in. You want the nations to have control over their infrastructure. It becomes a national security issue. If, for example, you know, your nation comes in conflict with another nation that, suddenly says, no, you can't have this anymore. And your payment infrastructure goes down and you can't collect taxes. Like that's a huge national threat. So that's where the digital sovereignty starts to come in as part of this digital infrastructure. And I think there's a reevaluation about whether the entire world being so dependent on US based tech oligarchies is in their national interest. And I think that that's a rather timely part of the conversation. So then you kind of get further into it and it's like, okay, well, do the pieces talk to each other? You have all of these different agencies, they have all these different budgets. Well, can you share information back and forth in a way that you would need to? Are you reinventing the wheel there? And then there's kind of a more philosophical question, which is, do is the public getting the value out of this? Or are you just funding some sort of private monopoly? So I think open source is a big part of that conversation. And that's where we get into the idea of this digital public infrastructure being a public good in the same way that we manage water for our collective benefit. Maybe we should start to think about managing and engaging with our digital footprint in the same sort of way.
There's so much nuance around, and there's a lot of politics involved. Anytime you're dealing with international efforts like this, you're suddenly into, well, what is an India's advantage versus the European Union's advantage, and so it is an interesting time where there are different plays. My understanding of the digital public infrastructure is that it includes open source as a big part of it, but isn't necessarily open source. That there's the Microsoft and others and Google are pushing ideas around digital public infrastructure that involves their infrastructure as a core piece of this. And that's sort of one. And if you're looking at data centers, there's definitely arguments for having some big players involved in managing at least some of those data centers. But there's also like digital public goods, and Drupal 2 or so years ago became a digital public goods, which is a certification that is managed by the Digital Public Goods Alliance. And again, it's the idea of open source, but also good documentation, security, privacy, like respecting sort of a gold standard of what government should be investing in. And Typo3 is also a member. Joomla most recently became a member. So there's a movement of organizations moving towards adopting digital public goods as a standard, more than just a license. It's also like, is this worth investing in as an institution that has aligned values? And the last one, which is also tied to where there's both proprietary and open source solutions involved, is GovStack, and which again, this interesting idea, like how do you take the idea of government and break it into blocks and say, what are the things that government needs, and can we create a set of requirements that says this is what government should be looking for in terms of interoperable systems? That, like, what is the CMS layer, what is the authentication layer, what is this how do we structure this in a way that allows for governments to start thinking about reusable components, and as opposed to every project is a special snowflake, because they really aren't. And yet the mindset of government procurement is very much around, this is my project and my baby, and I'm going to develop my special baby, and it'll be unique and different from everyone else's. And it's like, no, this is just a bunch of pieces with some custom code to make it unique, but it's 99% of it's the same as the project next door.
So, couple of things there. One, I will add a link in the show notes to a 2023 keynote from the New England Drupal Camp where Whitney Hess talks about the inner workings of being a public good. She also talks about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So, that could be interesting extra information for our listeners. So, Tiffany, I want to go back to what you were talking about around digital public infrastructure and ask, well, I'll start with the question and then I'll provide a little bit of context as to why I'm asking the question, right? Moving in this direction, right? Do we risk stifling innovation? And the reason I ask this is because, as well, maybe this is more of a US centric problem. Plus, as we know, like, government doesn't always move as quick as it should. And going back to your example of like, we standardizing a payment gateway, right? So, like, say, they standardize on Stripe, right? And, Stripe's great. I love Stripe. Like, I think that's the right choice. But maybe there's another service that is coming in that could be better, and another process that could be better, right? Do we risk stifling the ability to innovate moving in this direction, or basically not being able to kind of quickly shift to emerging technologies by doing this?
I think it goes to the maturity of the organization, right? I mean, you're an enterprise architect, so you run across this all the time, I'm sure as well, right? Which is there's a difference between making a choice because of a personal preference and making a choice that truly is net better, right? And so I think that the way that you balance the kind of the tension between innovation and standardization, or is that what you do is you say, okay, if you're going to deviate from our standards, this is what has to be met in terms of interoperability and security and other considerations, right? So it requires a maturity of a policy infrastructure that in my experience isn't yet always fully there, particularly in government. And so what we're trying to do, and I think those who are really engaged in this space are trying to do, is to make sure that we're not continuing to waste public dollars reinventing things that then can't talk to each other and that then become technical debt or become a system that gets thrown away. So much of the money that goes into public technology projects, I think it's something like 60% of them fail out of the gate, right? So I think that when you are able to provide some guidance in terms of, okay, this, if you don't have a good reason not to do it, here's your basis. I think that there's a lot of value in that. And I think that there are good reasons to try new things and to bring, new components in. But I also think that it's, I love it when someone says, okay, if you're going to go down this route, these are the criteria you have to meet so that we
Mhm.
don't then have to rewrite all of our reporting systems so that we can get the data out of it. And it's, our systems can continue to talk to each other so that you're not building yet another abstraction layer around this rules. Does that make sense?
And yeah, and I mean, I guess as you were describing that, I guess it kind of like, hey, it's better to start from somewhere than nowhere, right? There's at least a bar, right?
Mhm.
And if it's built in true open source fashion, right, you have the ability to enhance, grow, have a conversation about, pushing it forward. So, I guess that all definitely makes sense.
John, I wanted to push back briefly on your Stripe issue because I mean, people are like engineers like Stripe because it works, and for that matter, citizens like it because it's our consumers like it because it's easy and it works and it's reliable. But the challenge is, and then Tom Greenwood, who's the CEO of the Whole Grain Digital in the UK, he raised this in this blog post, the idea that as soon as you have a single global payment processor and you're using that in your farmers markets or any other places, you're siphoning money out of your economy, and your money is not going to your local economy. It's going to some big company and their shareholders in Silicon Valley. And there's value in solving a problem, and those people that solve problems should be recognized and should be compensated for that. But having a platform and having that network effect, so that we're actually stopping other players from coming in and innovating beyond what Stripe has done, because because Stripe has already captured the market. And should we not be trying to say, okay, yes, you should get some compensation for that? Should you get billions and billions and billions until the end of time because you've solved that problem? No, like that doesn't work. There should be some sort of process where yes, you get some compensation for solving a unique problem, and yes, you're rewarded for that. But you shouldn't be like social media is another great example where like how much of our lives, our attention have been captured by the views of a few people in Silicon Valley who are dominating the ways with which we can express and communicate ourselves on the platforms that they've arbitrarily created. And it's not like they're necessarily bad platforms, but it's limiting the ways that we can innovate because a few individual people are making decisions on how because of the challenges of networks and platforms.
Yeah, I mean, we need to solve the network effect problem, right? You need to have the that, and Mastodon is great because you can kind of have your own simple local group and community, but getting back into kind of a wider community can be quite difficult, right? So you kind of need the the whole point of social media is to interact with people, right? So if you're interacting with only two other people, how social is it? But if you have only one provider for whatever topic you're discussing, whatever, you're beholden to that platform's direction as
I,
well. So
I
it's
was-
a
I
tough problem, but
just want to encourage people to look up Cory Doctorow's and shitification because that's what all these
yeah,
platforms are moving towards, right? So, like, yeah, you become the product.
It doesn't have to be that you're the product. I do think that when we have kind of de facto monopolies, right, then it places whether it's companies or governments at risk, right? So we had a client, a government client, who obviously uses Microsoft Office, right? That's what they've standardized on. Well, Office, as we all know, increased its per seat licensing because it added those AI features, which you didn't have the option to not get.
and
But
most people
then
don't
this
want it.
agency had a $2 million budget shortfall because of the extra $6 per license. It's not like they could say, "We're just gonna not use Office in this agency," right? It becomes a big problem, right? Budgets don't go up by as much as software companies would like their licensing fees to go up, especially right now in the age of AI.
That side note, tinfoil hat moment, but my theory
Oh
is that
boy, here it
a
comes.
lot of these the way AI has yet to find a profitable s problem to solve, I guess, right?
Mhm.
So everybody's they're all searching for how are we gonna be profitable, and I think the ones that are going to be able to be successful longer term are the ones like Google, Microsoft, where they're just tacking on a fee and subsidizing the cost of their research in AI. Same because Google's the same way. Like, you do have an easier way to opt in or opt out at the moment, but like they're basically charging you more for it, whether you use it or not, to subsidize the research that they're doing, trying to find that solution. And I mean, from Microsoft's perspective, it makes sense because I mean, $6 a seat is a lot, and they're tying it to something that I would argue most people don't want or need,
Well,
but it's kind of enforced. They have vendor lock-in.
correct. And that's why open source is so big in these conversations.
Yeah,
You
because
know,
Drupal obviously is pushing AI hard too, but the nice thing is you can kind of pick and choose when to like, I'm working with clients right now implementing some AI integrations that I think will be useful for them. I think it'll be really valuable, but most of my clients have 0 need for AI on their websites, and the fact that it's a contributor project that I can just not install for the clients that don't need it, I don't even have to worry about it. And then the clients that do need it, you kind of figure out what the community is doing and what works and implement it in a way that works for that particular client. Yeah. The distributed
So
open source.
I don't know. I'm getting like anti-capitalist vibes here a little bit, and I think like I don't know the message. I think I would like to, or at least how I would like to interpret the message, and you can tell me where I'm wrong here, please do. But like instead of being like anti-business or anti-businesses making money. Like it feels to me like we need businesses and government to work better to use that money smarter, right? And don't get me wrong, I do agree that there should not be like one player capturing all of the business in the world. Like there should be opportunities for innovation, there should be opportunities for competition. That's not what I'm saying, but like ultimately, I think Tiffany's starting point here was that like we need to look at making sure that we're effectively using funds to build solutions that can grow and you know be sustainable to continue to evolve that feature or thing, right? I mean, I think we've all seen projects, we've all seen, government projects where somebody builds something and it's like it's this black box and it doesn't you can't extend it. You can't improve it. You can't it's just like, here's the thing. We paid $1 million for it and it
Mhm.
just does this thing. And it's going to do it for the next 5 years. And then we're going to throw it out and spend another $1 million to do it. Right. As open source practitioners, right, we understand that, hey, you can, and Drupal, again, great example of this for the last, what, 25 plus years. Like you can start with something, an MVP, put money into that to build it, and then over the next X number of years, improve it and grow it and build it so that it keeps working for you and improving your experience and evolving and innovate it well into the future, right? So I mean, I think instead of like us saying like companies are bad, right? And I'm not saying that anybody actually said that, but like that was kind of the vibe I was getting. I'm just saying.
So,
But like, hold on, let me just
yeah.
finish that thought, and then it's all you. But like, I think like we just need to look at like, okay, let's just spend the money more effectively and think about being more future proof and moving forward as opposed to like, I don't know, siloing it up. Mike, go for it.
So just on the idea of it being anti-capitalist, I mean, I owned a business for 21 years. Tiffany still does own a business. We're not anti-capitalist, but when you have market capture, that's anti-capitalist. When you have a platform that blocks out competition where you can't leave, like, I mean, I understand that that is an incredibly profitable way to go out
Absolutely,
and make money.
100%, 100% agree with that.
And
Right?
and,
I
and you could
definitely.
go further than that. Like looking at like if you look at government, the number of how much of our tax dollars are going to a few big US multinational corporations, the Deloittes, the Microsofts, the IBMs, the Oracles, like a huge portion of the of tax dollars globally, and let alone business dollars, like our money is going to support these giant corporations who have defined what is what is modern digital. And I don't think that like that platform, they've captured the market of several different places, and it is, I would say, anti-capitalist because they've captured the client.
Is there no trickle down there though? I mean, a lot of those companies have open source. Nick is getting on his soapbox. I can see him doing it, but he's muted, so nobody can hear him.
Yeah, let's get back to the show. I mean, no, there's no trickle down. Trickle down economics do not work. This
Well, but okay, so maybe trickle down is
like
not the right word, but a
let's
lot of those companies
let's
have
get
open
back to the
source
show.
offices and they're putting money into open source, right? Like, and I don't know.
That's a different show.
But yeah, it is a
Yeah.
different show. We'll
Yeah,
get
let's
I
back
get
may
on
be
back
on that
topic.
show too, but
I
yeah,
will
let's get
say,
back
Mike, like I agree with you. I can also kind of see the benefits of why they're doing it. But anyway,
Well, yeah,
we'll
because
move
they
on.
because from one organization, they just made $2 million a year. That's why they're doing it, and they need to fund the AI research. But,
well, and the
um,
organization can't even use the AI tools, right? They gain no productivity
yeah,
because they have a policy
exactly.
layer right around it. So
Right.
I think that's the difficulty around it, and that's just one organization. But there's
Eh,
lots of different ways where if we think about, okay, how do we make it interoperable? How do we prevent vendor lock-in? How do we give that kind of optionality so that we're maximizing the benefit to the end user? That's what I care about rather than maximizing shareholder value, in other places, right? When I have my public servant hat on, that's what I'm interested in, is making sure that we're continuing to increase the value that's delivered back to the public, right? So it's this idea that the public dollars should go toward public software.
I
The
agree with that 100%. And in my like rose-colored glasses mind, I'm like, hey, if you do that, then you can build shareholder value.
Yeah, just to kinda close this out, I was gonna say, like, it kinda brings back the open there's, like, edge cases too with things like email, right? Email email is an open spec. It's one of the success stories of the internet, right? It kinda just works no matter what, but if you're going to provide custom emails, I mean, there's only a few services out there that you can use that provide good value, right? I'm not gonna set up an email server at my house and manage the spam and all that kind of stuff myself, right? And and realistically, who can you use? I mean, you can use your ISP. We all know people that have at Verizon.net email addresses. You can use Google, you can use Microsoft, and it's the same kind of thing where the we need a solution on both sides. Like you need the spec, but you also need a service that people can use that's sustainable and interoperable. And that's the hard part. If anybody solves that, let me know because yeah, it's a big problem. It's a hard problem to solve.
Okay. So, like, Dries wrote on his blog a few months ago about funding open source like public infrastructure, which is we've just been talking about that, right? I'm wondering though, like, what does that look like specifically for Drupal? Is it, you know, public funding or public infrastructure funding for things like the DA to basically keep up the servers and you make updates and provide security team support and like how does that like what I'll just restate the question. What does that look like for Drupal? Like how does it how do those two things connect?
I, I think there's a lot of organizations or a lot of governments that are now starting to talk about public money, public code. Trying to go off and to put that lingo in as a simple reminder that anytime that we should be aspiring to having all public money built around digital government infrastructure to be public code. And yeah, absolutely, it comes down to seeing that organizations are able to build a fund looking at supporting organizations like the Drupal Association, the German sovereign tech agencies being quite useful in supporting the Drupal Association. Like that's one way that we've been involved. But there's also efforts to try and look at the setting up a European sovereign tech fund as well to try and build that out of a global process. And I do think this is something that needs to be spread out to other governments or agencies around the world. But the easiest way is just to find ways to get governments and others to start engaging with the community, coming to events again, being part of that, looking at ways to contribute code back, learning from the Drupal community and engaging with the Drupal community to say, well, how do we learn about what effective open source management looks like? Not just sort of throwing a project up on GitHub, but saying, okay, let's engage and bring in a feature that we care about and make sure that we're contributing and our staff learns and is part of the community. So I think there's lots of ways. But Tiffany, from the Drupal Association's perspective, you'd have a better sense, I think.
Well, I think we're working on right now is an upstream support that would allow us to engage. So a lot of governments, we're a 501(c)(3) based in the United States, and so even if we were, governments in the U.S. cannot pay us, right? So they can't give you a donation. They can't just give money away. That's not how governments are structured. So it does have to be around some sort of service. And so what we're looking at is kind of what is an upstream support package and what kind of guarantees can we give back to them that would help support the infrastructure that their projects depend on. And then also, as that program becomes successful, that allows us to then start to create an infrastructure to support the maintainers as well, right? So this is, I think, a bigger issue when you have government agencies are not allowed to just, do a bug bounty or other things. They have a lot of procurement rules. So part of it, I think, goes to what Mike was talking about earlier with those procurement agents and making sure that they understand that it's not just about putting, we have a preference for open source technologies into an RFP or an RFI or some, call for proposals. It's about understanding and evaluating the vendors that you get. Are they extractive of those open source communities, right? So I can be an agency that just uses open source, But if that agency doesn't give back, if that agency doesn't participate in best practices, if that agency doesn't, release the modules or support the infrastructure, support the community, and support the other maintainers, are you really getting the benefits of open source, or are you undermining what you're trying to actually support? So I think a lot of working with those procurement officers in various as well as OSPOs to make sure that we have some language that they can just plop into RFPs, making sure that they know to give preference to those who are actual, contributing members of an open source community like Drupal. I think that would actually start to close the loop because there's such a dynamic flywheel effect that we can get in open source. But part of it is that our flywheel is very leaky. And a lot of the biggest projects go to folks who don't contribute back into the community in any way, shape, or form. So while the economy that Drupal has is probably in the billions, we really see very little capture of that to come back into funding innovation, let alone just making sure that our basic needs, our infrastructure needs are met. So I think it's a bigger conversation. We're kind of right at the tip of starting to have those conversations, and I expect you'll see something coming out of the Drupal Association in the next coming months.
Tiffany, if we look 5 years into the future, what role do you see Drupal and the broader open source community playing in shaping global digital infrastructure and sovereignty?
I think Drupal's going to be playing a leading role in this. As has been talked about in this episode, we're one of the very few open source communities that doesn't have a single privileged actor behind it. And so I think that makes our voice very important as a part of this conversation and the way that we lead on open source. So I think that we're going to be involved and we're going to be at the table of trying to create these strategies and programs and approaches that can scale and work for open source, from those little emerging projects to the ones that are very, very large like ours. So we have a unique perspective, and I think it's a long-term perspective really rooted in this idea of resilience and being based in the community. So I'm excited for the conversation. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, our federated work in Europe is a big part of this, and I'm very involved in that work as well. Seeing how we can make sure that we're not just dependent on a 501(c)(3) in the U.S. We are a global project, and most of our contributors are actually not in the U.S. Most of the services are used outside of the U.S., and most of the funding that we currently get is actually from the U.S. So I think that highlights an opportunity for us to be able to become more globally resilient, to help us better, both reach out and engage different communities, business communities and developer communities and student communities around the world, but also to make sure that economic pressures in one region don't disproportionately impact our project. So it is all about resilience and making sure we have a model that not only scales for us, but then can be used for others. I'm excited to be part of that.
I see this as I think that so many people look at the web as just hiring an agency like Civic Actions or Palantir or others as just being, you're hiring a plumber and you want them to go off and implement, to add the pipes. And I think that more and more, like, as governments start to sort of look at the infrastructure and understand the complexities of it, I'm hoping that in 5 years' time, that people who've been involved in looking at government technology like Evolving Web, like others, like are actually are being involved in the policy discussions around this, to say that people who understand the technology and understand the communities and understand how these pieces can fit together and work more effectively together through collaboration, through proper governance, through good documentation, and thinking sort of long term throughout the technology, like our community has done, that there's a real opportunity to try and bring this together, so that the experience that we've built over nearly 25 years is something that can allow us to play more of a role of an open source statesman of a sort, because the web is the front end of most citizens' interactions with their government. If we can play, not that the Drupal's a be all and end all, but we are a dominant player in this space, and we can do more to go off and open up the doors to other technologies, both in the CMS level, but also on the stacks underneath, so that there's a definition of a good that we can all start working towards.
Well, Tiffany and Mike, I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. It's always great to have both of you on to talk about these topics, and sincerely appreciate the efforts and the work that you guys are doing to keep us apprised of this, keep us involved in this, and keeping us pushing forward. I think this is super important work, and we all should be aware and helping to support in any way we can. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
That's great. Thank you.
But before we close out, were any of the talks recorded? Do you know if they're available online? If people wanted to listen back?
There.
Okay. I'll ask for a link for that.
Yeah,
And
mine I think I put mine up on LinkedIn, and, they were all hour-long sessions, but
right. Awesome. Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on the socials with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
Want to be a guest on Talking Drupal or our new show, Talking TD Cafe? Click the guest request button in the sidebar at talkingdrupal.com.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Sustainability all over again. Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron.
All right. Tiffany, if folks wanted to get a hold of you, how best could they go about doing that?
I am Ferris on Drupal.org and at LinkedIn at Tiffany Farriss. That's Farriss.
Wonderful. Mike, what about you?
In most social media is M Gifford, but I have a really short domain name. I have ox.ca. So if you go to ox.ca, you
Hmm.
can find all the other ones as well. So
Can you
and
spell that for me?
ox.ca.
Perfect. Maya, what about you?
Best LinkedIn, Maya Scheffer, or also at Drupal.org, Maya Lena.
Awesome. Nick?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me personally at picozzi.com or on social media and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And if you want to learn more about EPAM, you can find us at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks a lot, everyone.